Everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we're going to be talking about two albums, not just two regular sized albums. We're going to be talking about two double albums this week, fun sized albums. We're going to be talking about the latest album from Taylor Swift Tortured Poets Department, of course, but now we're going to talk about Cindy Lee's Diamond Jubilee. So, Ryley, why don't you tell us a little bit about why this Cindy Lee is such an interesting artist and why there has been such a fascinating spotlight that's being cast on this album right now?
I would be delighted to do that, Jake. Cindy Lee is the persona of one Patrick Flegel, who if anyone knows this artist from their previous work, they may know them as the guitarist and front person of the late 2000s post-punk band Women, which of course ended acrimoniously with a very fiery breakup before some of the members of that band reformed to form the post-punk band Viet Cong, which then renamed themselves Preoccupations. There's post-punk lore goes deep here, but most of it's not really relevant because Pat Flegel did not join Preoccupations. They went on to release records under the name Cindy Lee, which they have described as their drag persona. And they have, in fact, released a number of albums as Cindy Lee. The album we're going to be talking about today, Diamond Jubilee, is actually the seventh album credited under that name. And it is very much the culmination of that project as well. I believe that Cindy Lee have indicated that they do not intend to tour under the name Cindy Lee following the shows that are being played around this album. I think as well, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think they've essentially spoken more or less to the fact that this will be the last Cindy Lee album as well. Although I think those quotes came from before the album had the runaway success that it has had. So we'll see what happens with Cindy Lee from this point. But when I say runaway success, what I mean is that Cindy Lee's Diamond Jubilee became a couple of weeks after its release in mid-April, the recipient of the highest grade that Pitchfork have given an album since Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters in 2020. Diamond Jubilee received a 9.1, and this essentially set certain circles of music consuming internet aflame. One of the most interesting things about this album, being so critically successful, is that it actually has a fairly limited release model. It was released as a full YouTube video that doesn't even include inbuilt timestamps for the songs, and it was also a GeoCities link release to download the WAV files of the album, as well as a suggested donation amount of 30 Canadian dollars as well. But those are the only two ways you could access the album, still can access the album. It does not exist on any of the major streaming platforms, not even Bandcamp. It is just either YouTube or you download the files yourself. So this is, of course, in the age in which we exist, where all music is available on demand. Give me it now. I want to stream it. And there's a certain sense of entitlement where if an album isn't put on these streaming services, that is a story in and of itself. That is a choice in and of itself, right? To limit the accessibility of the music for people. But for whatever reason, that is what Cindy Lee has chosen to do. And so the level of success that this album has had critically reflects interestingly on that, because it means that, well, for one, it means that this album, which was already set up to not really reach a very wide audience because of that release model, now suddenly has people flooding to download the album or listen to it on YouTube. But it also means as well that that release model, even though it was for a quiet, humble bedroom project that was not expected to make much noise, now becomes a kind of broad statement that exists in reaction to all these other major releases that are happening at the moment that, of course, are widely accessible and, if anything, inescapable. There's something refreshing and humble and even beautiful about this massive 2 hour album existing in this very limited space where it requires a certain level of investment to even access it. It still is free to access, but it does mean that you have to kind of be sufficiently motivated and you have to be kind of willing to step what is likely to be outside of your usual listening habits to consume it. And I think part of the effect of that as well is meaning that you're more likely to kind of engender a fondness for this music, I think, because it requires a certain level of effort to access. And so you're going to want to feel cognitively as though your effort is rewarded. So that I think on a certain level has boosted a lot of people's affinity for it. It's one of those albums where the vast majority of people that hear it tend to feel very fondly about it. But I would be doing a disservice if I said that was purely the product of like psychological tricks. It's a great album. It's a magnificent double album. In fact, it's actually, I'm going to say it right off the bat, this is my album of the year so far. I've fallen head over heels for this album. I came to it a little bit late, like a lot of people did, but the time that I've spent with it, it has been on, and I'm seriously not exaggerating when I say almost constant rotation. And when I say that, I mean I've had the YouTube video in my downloaded YouTube videos right at the top, just hit that shit basically every time I open the app when I'm on my way to work. Um, and it's only yesterday, the day before we record this, in fact, that I finally got the MP3 files into iTunes so that I could have it in my Apple Music library, which honestly felt a little bit sad because it felt a little bit like I was capitulating, that I was like, oh, now I'm like not experiencing it. But you know what? I had a couple of wonderful weeks where I was listening to that fucking thing on YouTube and relying on the comment that had the timestamps to get me to the tracks I was in the mood for. But really, the whole thing is masterful. And honestly, releasing it in a format where you have to kind of consume it in that way sort of enhances the effect of it, I think. Because while this is, I think, a very clearly constructed double record, even the description on YouTube specifies that there are 2 discs, and these tracks are on disc 1 and these tracks are on disc 2. And they have the same number of tracks, so that's easy enough to remember. Despite that, it is a very easy record, I think, to consume as a single statement. I mean, I would recommend breaking it up by discs, if only because the individual discs have such a nice, tidy structure to them that I think they are fairly easy to consume as like, this is disc 1, this is disc 2. These are separate entities that come together. But however you want to experience it, the most important thing is that you listen to it because this album it's really incredible. What is Cindy Lee? What is the project? So I mentioned it was Pat Fliegel's drag persona, but how that manifests is a an eclectic and diverse array of psychedelic pop music, essentially, that is largely heavily influenced by the manufactured brill building girl pop of the 60s, things you associate with bands like the Ronettes, and of course the influence of Phil Spector on the sound of their music. That is a heavy reference point, I would say, especially in the first half of the album. But you also have an array of other kind of influences from psychedelic rock to there's even a kind of krautrock track on here. There's some funk elements on here. There's a real whirlwind of sort of forgotten American musical traditions that I think sort of run through this album's identity. And as well as that, this is an album that is in a large part borrowing from a lot of the traditions and tropes of those those brill building girl pop songs, which is like, you know, woozy, pretty, dreamy, inoffensive, and soft-edged songs about wanting to be loved and about being in love and about devoting yourself and about loneliness. And when I say soft edged, I mean that these are subjects that have sadness and bitter tones to them and an ugly underside. But of course, it's also gauzy and it's also softened for the most part, such that it's really about capturing that kind of syrupy, sugary feeling of being lost in your emotions and daydreaming about, being with someone you care about or about being free. There's a lot of levels beneath that on which the album works as well. But fundamentally, when you listen to it, those are the kinds of songs that you're going to get. You're going to get twists on these formats as well. Pat Flegel is an incredibly talented guitar player who has a really eclectic array of tones, but primarily these really kind of sharp, sort of twangy, uh, kind of acerbic tones that really kind of stick out against the more gauzy atmospheric soundscapes. It's an album to get absolutely lost in. I have a lot more to say about the structure and about what sort of is underlying it thematically, but I want to throw to you now, Jake, as someone who's kind of come on board the hype train a little bit later than me. What are your kind of overarching thoughts? What was your experience like listening to this for the first time? And what's your kind of general sort of feeling about Cindy Lee's Diamond Jubilee?
Do you remember, perhaps, on this very show, long time ago, I'm not even really sure in what context, but you told a story about when you were a kid and My Bloody Valentine released their self-titled album. And you ripped that from the internet in like insanely low quality and
Yes.
started listening to that on your MP3 player, and you became mildly obsessed with it and maybe even gave yourself hearing damage for about a week or two. Um, this album understands how valuable of an experience that is because it obfuscates everything and purely relies on your connection to the music itself to buoy you through whatever is standing in your way, that being the fact that you got a really super low quality thing. You had that experience, it became tangible for you, and you hold on to that. You have a memory, you have a fond memory because of that. And if I had to describe what Diamond Jubilee is for me, it's an album that celebrates the idea that you can make memories with it, which sounds probably kind of, highfalutin and maybe a bit cheesy. But in the climate of right now, I find this album's very existence to be so unfathomably refreshing. Because when I got word of this, when it was first taking off on places like Rim, I saw that it was a double album, how dense it was, that it had all this, stuff informing it. And I was like, man, fucking Taylor Swift's got a double album. This is a double album. Like, we're already suffering burnout this year, obviously. Like, you can kind of tell it's just like there are just a lot of records that have come out that have like failed to excite us, or it's been a very odd place being in this musical malaise for the last couple of months. And this album comes out of the blue, and all it had to do, the only thing it had to do, was demand something of me, and it shook me out of my little stasis. Because to me, like the way that this was released, making people go and downloading it, the project, it understands that, going on SoulSeek and downloading an album and adding it to your iTunes library is an active thing that you as a music listener can do. That the connection with the music is already beginning to form there. And that if you put in a little bit of the work, something else can happen. And that something else is this album to me clicking in a way that I don't think another album has clicked since we started reviewing records, and that I began to let go of all of the things that potentially got in the way of just my pure reaction to the music. And then once I was able to have that, it was so like, I mean, the clouds parted, the sky was blue, the grass was green. It was incredible. I mean, like, it literally felt like fucking touching grass listening to this shit. These organic instruments with this fucking weighty ass sound, but it's still so dreamy, so occasionally psychedelic. It just strikes this beautifully perfect balance. And then once you kind of get into the groove of it, there's so much more than just jagged edges that these songs are. To me, each song is almost like a declaration of purpose that music can be whatever this song makes it. It feels like I'm watching someone molding and sculpting clay rather than making a song and trying to stick to the rubric that people who make songs have to stick by. And I'm not saying that this is some like avant-garde, like the appeal of it is rooted squarely in something recognizable, and then turning it and making it just a little bit alien, just a little bit abnormal, just a little bit queer, just a little bit strange. And it's almost like it's mildly trying to offset you as a listener. And I found that to be surprisingly intimate, and it led me to having a much more positive, unfiltered, and again, observationally resplendent sort of listening to this. I got to think about how a song like Olive Drab, for example, which like this song should be sampled in a hip hop beat. Like it's a crime that it probably won't, but if it was, dude, it would fucking slam. And I thought about that, and then I started taking apart other songs in my head and being like, where would this be used as a sample? Because that's what a lot of this album does, is that it really makes a lot of its individual ideas stick out to you really, really colorfully. And you have really no choice just to be like, how does this make me feel? And
Mm.
again, it sounds very simple, but there is an art to this sort of back to basics approach of clearing the slate and just saying like, here is this thing, have it, be with it, experience it. And yeah, I can like, again, this is an album with a high bar for entry, but if you value the same kinds of things that we do, there's so much here,
It,
and I've got a lot to say about it.
it feels like a treasure chest. Like it feels like a time capsule, a treasure chest. It feels like unearthing these just riches. You know, I've seen other critics describe it as a kind of greatest hits album of new
Hmm.
material. Basically, it kind of
Yep.
runs like it has a feeling as you listen to it of like you're running through the whole career of some artist from their early inception, where you can tell early on in the album that they're much more heavily influenced by that 60s girl pop stuff, to the second half of the record where you're just pulling from more directions and you're doing more interesting, more abstract things with those influences. And the songs tend to be a little bit more daring, I would say, in the second disc. So it really has the feeling of kind of like flowing through uh, if not a career, then at least an evolving artistic process that's becoming more and more ambitious and thoughtful as it goes. Like those sort of tossed off kind of like incomplete ideas like Olive Drab, which like kind of feel like they're running over with ideas they don't know what to do with. They come earlier in the record because it's kind of like it's a little more, early in the way that this sound and this project is developing. And then later on, the songs get to be more consistently fully formed. It's interesting how the record does that while also still feeling continually satisfying as well. It's not the case that the early stuff feels underdeveloped compared to the later stuff. It's very well developed and it's very well structured, and it's immediately, grabs you and pulls you in from the first track. There's certainly highlights on this thing that I could shout out, although kind of similar to what you were saying, it feels a little bit less about the songs individually, although they are immaculately conceived. One of the things that Pat Flegel is most talented for with this project is just an abundance of beautiful melodies. Every single song has them. They are what draw you in. The melodies are the main gravitational focuses of these songs, and the album is such a dramatic success because of how plumb with fantastic melodies it is all the way through. Yes, they can be fairly straightforward, and then there can be some that are quite similar, but the album, each individual song, I think, with only a couple of exceptions really, but the vast majority of songs really pull you in with a combination of simple but really effective and really memorable ideas that make coming back to the album feel very familiar and comfortable and warm and homely. Like to me, this album has just become to feel like such a part of the fabric of my life in the time I've spent with it. And I feel like I know it inside out so well now. That said, there are individual showstopper moments that absolutely take my breath away. I think one of the most beautiful songs, I want to say it's one of the most beautiful songs about like okay, I guess I'm going to get into my queer reading of this now. I was going to kind of leave it for last, but honestly, I'm not going to have much more to say prior to it. So I'll sort of just get into it. Uh, Pat Flegel is a non-binary artist. I believe that's right. This is I think, an explicitly queer record, also implicitly in a lot of ways as well. But when presenting the persona of the artist as the drag performer, then that's explicitly queer. And so the floodgates are open then for reading a lot of the way this record sounds, not even just the lyrics, but just the presentation of the record, the performance of this music through that lens. I don't know the extent to which Cindy Lee wishes for the music to be read through that lens, but it's how I approach it as a queer person, definitely. And here's the thing, right, is that the reference point that this is pulling from, the primary one, that kind of 60s brill building girl pop music, right? That is some of the most overtly and obviously constructed music of all time. Like factory, like it's even to the extent that the genre is named after the building where a lot of those artists were like recorded. That says something about how constructed it was, how kind of built by largely men it was, men who would decide what these songs were going to be about, what the lyrics were going to be, and who the women would be that would sing it. Deeply, fake music on that level, and deeply fake bands. Of course, bands which had very real human beings in them who brought a lot of power and a lot of personality and a lot of themselves into that fake world. They absolutely did, and that shouldn't be diminished. But of course, it is very constructed music from the, you know, inception of it. So for this male constructed idea in the 60s of what womanhood is, of what girlhood is, of how girls feel, and the kinds of things girls say, and the way they think about love and they think about boys. For that style of music to be echoed and repurposed by a queer person, someone who has, and again, I don't want to speak for Pat Flegel's own experiences. I can't do that, but I'm just sort of talking in a vacuum here. And also for myself as well. To hear music that's rooted in so much of that be repurposed to essentially, again, whether it's explicit or not, but basically to essentially talk about the experiences of being in love and of having attraction and of negotiating through your own internal world of how you feel about yourself as a desirable object, how you desire the people that you love, the way you feel about the objects of your affection. Hearing that through an explicitly queer lens is insanely powerful because it is taking something that was initially constructed by men and fully seizing that. It is a vision, not just, you could say it's a vision of womanhood, but it is a vision of self-determination outside of any particular gender construct that is so effective for how it takes something that was the epitome of not self-determination, of a kind of constructed reality, and making it your own. Bands like the Ronettes began to seem trite in the kind of postmodern era of the 80s and 90s, where that kind of sugary sentiment sounded more fake than ever, and there was a desire to kind of unpack all of that with irony. But now we're kind of, I feel like, existing in an age where, types of music that were once considered fake or manufactured or inauthentic or lacking in soul are now being repurposed by a new audience, by a new generation, by people who themselves are disenfranchised and coming from a place of not just their artistic journey being about seeking identity, but their life journey as well being about seeking identity in a way where their current identity is decided for them in a way that takes their agency away. To have people now, using these kind of frameworks, musical frameworks, to kind of pursue those ideas is so, so beautiful to me. And again, so much of queer gender performance is aping an idealized stereotype of your gender. The girl pop of the 60s is that stereotype at its most stilled and obvious. So when you perform that in an explicitly queer mode, you find a depth and that veneer of womanhood that was constructed largely by those cis men. You reclaim that, you make those sentiments feel real, even without changing the substance of them all that much. That's why, like, this album can be effective even when the sentiments are things as simple as all I want is you, I dream about you, I love you, all of that kind of stuff. There's a weight to that, the fact that it is so simple and so straightforward. It has new meaning now. It has been taken by force from its patriarchal origins. And that to me is what I feel when I listen to a song like one of my absolute favorite songs on here, If You Hear Me Crying, which is, it's a beautiful, sad song about, the need to feel intimacy and connection, but being alone and being untouched and all of those feelings. And it's got a really fun sort of bouncy swagger to it as well. It's that kind of element of lightness, of levity, of rhythm focused, funky sort of sounds. Um, and then it just has this guitar that comes into the song that sounds like someone tearing an X-Acto knife through the sky. Like it just rips into the fabric of the song. And that's how it feels to be to be feeling those feelings, to be wanting to be in that space and having to confront the feeling of inauthenticity, or the feeling of like judgment, or the feeling of like you can't really feel this way because that's not who you are, it's not who I see you as. To just cut through all that with a scraping guitar sound, it's like I'm reading completely into it, my own interpretation, but that's just how it feels. It is just, it's a waking up. And that's one example. A song like one of my absolute favorite on the record, which is Flesh and Blood, which is my favorite song of the year. That is less about any individual sentiments and more just about how utterly freeing the guitar sounds in that song. The the way the song conveys that sense of escape, that sense of being more than the box that you're contained within, and then actualizing that into this just sound of freedom, basically, is so good. I can't go anymore because there's so many songs that do this in their own ways. Jake, is there any particular highlights that you want to shout out, or anything you want to add to what I've been saying, or anything?
Definitely a handful, but I really resonate with the freeing kind of read on this, is just because a lot of this feels like it is engineered to be cathartic in a way that's very kind of hard to initially recognize, but once you get with it, it's so satisfying. Like again, you're totally right about Flesh and Blood. It's one of the best songs on here. It made me think of like a lo-fi, like a really lo-fi version of The Strokes. Like there's something about that insistent rhythm that just made me think of like this definitely sounds like it could come off the first Strokes album.
Yeah.
Um and even that Kingdom Come and the way that that song is mic'd, like that is so fucking Panda Bear. That is so fucking Animal Collective. I Have My Doubts has a core melody that sounds like Black Sabbath's Changes, and it's a really good melody. So much of this record is just this warm, rustic, comforting, and it's just the right amount of otherworldly without being intangible. And then midway through it, you get Till Polarity's End, and it's like the entirety of the 1960s just goes supernova and explodes, becomes a black hole, and then swallows time. It's like this is the most massive song of the year so far. Like I don't think like it feels like it's bursting out of the MP3 format. And fucking Stone Faces, dude, there needs to be more zombies worship in modern music. Like, I mean, the tongue clicking on here, fucking and snaps, they're totally aping the fucking the hook from Time of the Season, and I love them. They should do that. It's awesome. Dracula, what a groovy fucking kraut rock can-ass song. I love that shit. Like, and the guitar tones at the end of this sound like the Mars Volta. Like, dude, there really is a sonic palette for everybody somewhere in here. There's fucking the hypnotic fucking repetition of government checks. That to me, the album's crown jewel is Don't Tell Me I'm Wrong. And it's hard to put down why, but it's a perfect microcosm for how I feel about the album, and that I don't fully understand this song. I don't fully understand this album, and I really relish that. There's a curiosity that comes with that. There's an embrace that knowing that you can never possibly know everything about a work of art, that just it makes me feel reassured by the boundless limits of creativity. Frankly, it's this song is so otherworldly. It's liminal, but it's somehow also tense, and it's laid back, but somehow it's all of these things, and I adore it. Like it's so lonely, but it's so captivating. It really really works for me in a way that it feels like I can only do about 80% of the justice of. That other
Mhm.
20%, the words don't exist in the English language.
One of my favorite moments on the album is in the song right after Don't Tell Me I'm Wrong, which is called What's It Gonna Take, which is this
Yeah,
really sort of slow, kind of like end of the night dancing, waltzing with your partner sort of
waltz.
vibe, which
Yeah,
a lot of the album has that. But it just like kind of slowly builds and builds. And then there's just like this crazy sort of like crash of cymbals or something that happens in the last like 30 seconds of the song where it just goes nuts. And it's like, to me, it's like it's yeah, not to keep bringing it back to this, but like it feels like a kind of dysphoric awakening where it's sort of like you're jolted out of your peace by a kind of sudden awareness of yourself. And like that sounds really unpleasant, and I guess it is, but it's like just a really effective moment on the album. Again, totally projecting my experience onto it, but I do really love the ways that these songs can kind of sneak in these so much of the songs are built around these really kind of sickly sweet qualities, but they can just sneak in these like, kind of uglier aspects to them that just add a dimensionality to it. Like the second song on the album, Glitz, as well. It has this tone on the main guitar part where it's just like it's so layered in fuzz and like stickiness that it really feels wrong. Like it feels like it's kind of over compressed, and I really love the effect that that has. It's a really sweet sounding melody, a really kind of catchy one with a really nice strut to it, but it sounds like you've kind of sucking on a lemon while you listen to it, and I love that those kinds of contrasts. And the album can have kind of more still moments where you don't have any of that kind of uglier contrast. You just have kind of prettiness in a song like Baby Blue, for instance, or Dreams of You,
oh
like that
god,
early
so
stretch.
pretty.
It's gorgeous. It's delightful. Um, yeah, or like the outro to the whole album, 24/7 Heaven, which is kind of just like this gorgeous hanging drone track that just sort of feels like you've crystallized and you've lost all of the rhythmic elements and you're just kind of dancing in this space of color, basically. It's a great album. I don't feel too bad about not talking about it too heavily because I absolutely certain we'll come back to it at our end of year list anyway. And maybe then it'll feel more meaningful to talk about it because of how much time will have passed. It's just a really special album. It's hard. I feel like it's a little bit hard to sell to people because not just because of its length and its release format, but also just because it feels like it has been so heavily praised that I feel like it probably has a pretty high barrier for entry for people now, a certain level of expectation, maybe. And I don't know, maybe that will result in an experience that won't be for everyone. But I really do hope that people give this one a chance. Don't have to listen to it all in one go. Break it up. I saw a great tweet from a music writer. I think it was Matthew Perpetua, but I'm not 100% sure. It was someone, I'll try and check now, who said like to them it read like the first like 4 or 5 releases in an artist's career where it's like the first few tracks are like a debut EP, and then it's like the debut album, and then it's the second album on the second disc, and then at the end of it it's like a kind of B-sides EP, and it's like I really liked that idea. It was like a really thoughtful way
Yeah.
of like interpreting the structure. So there's a lot of ways you can experience this album. I really think obviously it's a great record that plays really well front to back, but I think that it also works if you just kind of take it in bite-sized chunks, dip into a song or two. What I think works about any given song in this album is also kind of what works about the others, more or less. So while the greatness of it, I think, is best appreciated in its totality, I think you can get a good sense of what is special about it from sampling really any given song on it. It's just a great collection of tracks that I'm thrilled to have discovered. I'm thrilled it got the level of attention it got because I may not have discovered it otherwise. So I'm just really grateful for that. And I've really kind of fallen head over heels for it. So whatever happens next for Cindy Lee, I hope they're able to. I hope that the success of this gives them the means to be able to pursue whatever they want to do next, whether it is this project or indeed something else entirely, because it feels like obviously a lot of time and work and love and care has gone into this, and the result is so plainly observable. This is absolutely this year's Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, for me, in the sense that it's just a long ass double album where I'm just on cloud nine the entire time.
And it's definitely, I would say, the album to best utilize the double album format since Dragon New Warm Mountain, like at least that I've heard. And
Yeah.
I know we definitely don't limit ourselves when it comes to what we listen to. And I'd really like to, again, me being the fucking eternal cynic that I am, trying to be an optimist. I want to believe that this album's success is because of how it kind of tacitly encourages you to listen to it. I want to believe that people resonate with it because they are meeting it on its own terms. And that to me, that just means that art is healthy. Art is alive if we're interacting with it like this. It's a sign that the ecosystem still has life in it. And sometimes in an uncertain climate, it's reassuring to have it. It's a deep comfort in a very uncertain time, frankly.
I'd agree.
And now we're going to talk about another notable double album that has been released very recently. You might have heard of it. It's called The Tortured Poets Department by Miss Taylor Swift. You also might have heard of her.
It's kind of a big deal. She's kind of an artist that we've kind of talked about kind of a couple of times in kind of a few different videos on this channel. And it seems as though we are continuing to be flush with Taylor Swift content, which, hey, I'm not complaining about. Certainly not, because it gives us another reason to welcome back one of what is becoming a regular guest on the show, Rhiannon, who is our resident Swiftie, our expert on all things Tay-Tay related, to not only give us some context as well on this particular moment for Taylor, but of course to talk about this much discussed and divisive album that has had the whole internet on fire for a couple of weeks now. So, Rhiannon, I'll throw to you at this point. What do we need to know about the Tortured Poets Department?
Yeah, so this was not only another one of her like surprise, here's a couple months before my next album release, but it's something that she's been working on since she was working on Midnights amidst the Eras tour and releasing all the re-recordings that she's done since then. So in the last 2 years, like this is the fourth album we've gotten in less than two years, which is a lot. During this time, she's gone through a really, really difficult breakup that has very much poured into a lot of the themes here in the writing and kind of given us this really reflective album on herself and how the industry and the public eye have really put her in a place where she doesn't feel human, and she doesn't feel like she can grieve. She doesn't feel like she can experience life in a normal way. And she really just kind of lays all of this out amongst what we thought was 16 tracks until those of us like me who were up listening to it found out at 2 a.m. that there was another 15 to go along with it. And
Second Taylor Swift album hit the towers.
Was that announcement, was that like, I know it was the night of the drop. Was it after it had already released?
yes.
So yeah, so people
It
were
was
already
similar
listening to it.
It was similar to the 3 a.m. tracks that she dropped after Midnight's released,
Okay.
except instead of like 6 songs, it's an entire second album. Well, not second, separate album, but
it's the same, amount of music essentially
Yeah.
as the album. Um,
Right.
it's really interesting. I think my broad sense of this album, like very broad, is that it's about the experience of being an artist and writing about heartbreak, and the way that, but more than just that, it's about when you've written about heartbreak for a considerable portion of your career, to the extent that your public persona and a lot of your identity and a lot of how you're conceived as a songwriter is based around that, how do you negotiate moving forward, being an honest and truthful artist, writing in a way that feels like it has integrity and that it speaks to your experience, when that experience continues to be heartbreak and difficult relationships, and a lot of positive stuff as well, a lot of really, really happy experiences, but also just a lot of bittersweetness, a lot of sometimes ugliness, sometimes sourness. So on the one level, it is like, it's what it's like to be an artist writing about heartbreak. On a different level, it's like what it's like to be someone who is sort of known for writing about heartbreak still at this point. And then on another level, it's like what it is to be the biggest, most sort of sought after public personality in the world, who is waging, a massive world tour that's kind of all consuming and all demanding, while also trying to negotiate and manage relationships and a personal life through that. And through the level of scrutiny that comes with having a celebrity that massive, and that sort of level of scrutiny that she's experienced is a huge theme on this album as well. But it's really interesting the way that Taylor talks about how she's scrutinized, how she's maligned, and how she's attacked, and more, well, more balanced than that, just the different ways that she's viewed on a record like this compared to a record like Reputation, for instance, which has its own kind of perspective and framework for talking about, you know, the rumors and the gossip mill and all that kind of stuff. It's a very different record to that record. I like that record a lot. I like this record a lot. They're very different. And this is obviously the kind of record that could only come at this point in Taylor Swift's career, maybe more than any other record she's done. It is so weighed by the context of who Taylor Swift is and has been up until this point, that I know that feels like a broken record statement. That's something you can say about a lot of her albums, but it feels like as Taylor continues to get bigger and bigger, the focus of her art and her songwriting is kind of forced to get more and more insular and more intimate, because the level of scrutiny on her and the level of attention on her and the level and the extent to which her life is viewed through this magnifying glass is so inescapable that you either have to pretend that that is not your existence at all and make a record like Folklore, which kind of steps completely outside of that, or you double down and you just embrace that as the way you're going to frame your art. So I see this in certain ways as a kind of extension of Midnight's, although I like this record a lot more than I like Midnight's. I think it is a more successful album in a lot of ways. To me, it's almost more interesting rather than a counterpoint to Midnight's. It's almost more interesting as a counterpoint to Folklore, which is like, which was this moment where kind of Taylor sort of reasserted herself as through the lens of a more kind of classical idea of what a singer-songwriter is. And here it's sort of like, sort of Taylor stepping away from that more kind of fictionalized space and kind of embracing more of like, well, you're all talking about these details of my life and these specific people in my life. So I'm going to make songs that both kind of respond to that, but also it's interesting, like, because Taylor's not, for the most part anyway, with a couple of exceptions, not really kind of addressing anyone on this album in explicit detail. She's removing enough of that from most of these songs for them to feel like they are broader depictions of a point in the spectrum of a relationship or of a heartbreak. But at the same time, there's these kind of, I feel like with this album there's this kind of winking acknowledgement of like, well, you're all talking about me, so I'm going to talk about me as well. That's kind of how I see this album more broadly. It's kind of hard to be a bit more specific than that without getting into the songs. But what do you guys think? What are your guys' perspectives on what this album is for Taylor? Like why she made this particular album at this point in time?
I think the angle here is really just to saturate the market with her music even more, to the point where it feels like the fact that this was a double album, or just the sheer raw density of the amount of music she's putting out, and obviously the self-conscious angle of the album, I think it's safe to say that Taylor Swift has some thoughts and opinions about the way that she's being perceived by the world around her. And that's basically the broadest theme I can come to when talking about Tortured Poets Department. And it's also the thing I find the most interesting, because a lot of people have been comparing this to Reputation. And I thought about it too, just because it's a bit unavoidable. But at the same time, the thing that causes the disconnect with that album for me is that the writing feels both too specifically about Taylor's cult of personality and persona, and also a bit too broad to draw any specific emotions from that experience. There's a bit more of a middle ground struck here that feels like it's a more well-rounded sort of execution of the concept of talking about the people who talk about Taylor Swift, whether that be ex-lovers, whether that be the press, whether that be her fans. I think it's safe to say that one of the few people in music today that can get away with just making a record that is for the fans and have that be an actual viable creative pursuit because of the size of her audience, because she's not limiting herself when she says it's for the fans, or when anyone would say it's for the fans, which is kind of what I would say is the purpose of the album. Is that I think that aside from that slant, that sort of more embittered angle, which I really like for the record, because this is the most legitimately pissed off I think that Taylor's ever sounded, like in a way that's really like passive aggressive and venomous, in a way that's like a little vicariously cathartic, I will admit. But at the same time, the idea here I feel like is almost to be a Taylor Swift pleb filter, because this is also subtextually an album about how much Taylor Swift doesn't like being Taylor Swift. And if you release a big fucking album in the middle of your most prolific phase of your career, where you're everywhere, where the biggest complaint about you is that you're everywhere, and then suddenly you make an album that's 30 songs long, I mean, I can only believe that this is slightly meant to take the eyes of people who Taylor might not want on her anyway, and say, if you keep paying attention to me, this is what I'm gonna keep doing, so stop. And she does that by pulling out some very tried and true Taylor Swift tricks that don't maybe sustain an entire 30 song long album for me, but remains compelling in its many very messy facets.
I want to bounce off that, because I've heard a lot of people, use that it's for the fans kind of ideology with this. But in all actuality, from a fan's perspective, it's not an album for the fans. It's an album for Taylor. I think this is, as much as she writes about her own life, and as much as she writes about her own experiences and her own emotions, I think this is the closest we have ever gotten to a literal look inside of Taylor Swift's diary. And it's her not cutting anything back or holding back or hiding the details that she doesn't want other people to know. This is her taking all of this anger and this heartbreak, all these emotions, and just letting them go once and for all. And I think it's wrapped up really nicely with the final anthology track, which we'll probably get there later. But I truly believe that over the last 2 years, writing and making this album is something that she needed more for herself than any fan needs or any listener needs or anything like that. I don't like the perspective of it being for anyone in particular, just because it's so personal.
I think, especially at this point in her career, I think Taylor Swift like any artist should, and like the vast majority of artists do. They make music primarily for themselves, and that's one of the things that makes artists so fascinating and so attractive, is that they feel as though they are doing something that is authentic to, something deep inside of them, and not something that is designed for or designed around some kind of external force. The moment you get a sense that an artist is kind of working in a space where they're tailoring their actions, no pun intended, for a specific external force or around that, they become less interesting, and they become kind of that you lose a certain connection to them, I think, the moment that they start doing that. I think that's why with a lot of big pop stars who aren't necessarily basing a lot of their pop personas around kind of artistic authenticity or anything, are not like people that, most people get kind of all that personally attached to or invested in, because it's hard to feel as though there's any, and again, it's not about necessarily like authenticity in some kind of like aesthetic sense. It's just about, you feel as though this person is making art that because they want to make this art, and because this art reflects something that they feel. And I think Taylor Swift is like one of the prime examples of that kind of artist in pop culture. And I definitely think that this album, in comparison to other records of hers over the last decade or so, feels a little bit more. It has a little bit more of that feeling of personal authenticity, because there's less dressing up. Because like most Taylor Swift albums are about Taylor Swift, but the thing is, but maybe that's not even a strong enough statement. All Taylor Swift albums are about Taylor Swift in some way or another. But like the thing with this one is that there's less dressing up Taylor Swift's persona or narrative and iconography and metaphor and set dressing and storytelling and any of those kinds of things. Uh, it is more. There's so much of all of that stuff, all of that kind of way in which Taylor talks about herself by, invoking certain pieces of American iconography uh, or kind of archaic, stereotypical storytelling tropes, so stripped away. I mean, she does play with tropes, like romantic tropes on this album in some kind of funny ways. You can get a sense of that from just looking at some of the song titles on this, but it's more like actively toying with those and kind of toying with your expectations of those than it is like kind of embodying them. Taylor is kind of speaking from a more personal place on this album, or at least she gives the sense that she is. And for that reason, I find it a lot more instantly kind of emotionally compelling than I found a lot of her records. And I want to, I feel like every statement I make in Taylor Swift has to be kind of, has to be justified in about 5 or 6 different ways, because there are different things I've said in the past that could contradict that.
Don't I know?
First thing I'll say is, why do I like this album, but I don't like Midnight's? When Midnight's was presented and packaged as this collection of late night thoughts, of this kind of, insight into Taylor Swift's soul. Well, firstly, I found that I found then, and I still find now, that record to be not very musically compelling and kind of a little sterile. And I do think that that robs from the emotional impact it's intended a lot of the time. I think more, especially than this record, that album, I didn't, my biggest issue with Midnights was that I understood the kind of conceptual thing of it, like where it was coming from and the way it was framed. But I didn't really consistently feel like that was actually reflected in the music that I was hearing. It felt like a PR team had designed that framing for a set of songs that Taylor Swift had created. And the songs, they varied in quality, and they were all unmistakably Taylor Swift, but I didn't feel like I could particularly meaningfully connect what the album was presenting to me with its actual contents all of the time. Sometimes I could. I'm not saying that was a consistent issue with the album, but a lot of the time it just felt like this was a set of songs that Taylor Swift had that were vaguely connected, in the sense that any set of songs you write about your life at a particular point in time or what you're thinking about in a particular point in time are vaguely connected. And it didn't really add up to much. There were also parts of that album that I felt like were glib and kind of a little bit, I don't know if I want to say shallow, but just kind of a little bit tossed off, in a way that's just like, this just isn't the attitude or the style from Taylor that I enjoy the most. This album, however, feels like it's so carefully and thoughtfully and from the bottom up constructed so that each song is a part of its broader thesis about, you know, the difficult conflicting pains of trying to maintain a romantic relationship when you're the most scrutinized person on the planet. That is like an immediate hook as a concept, and the whole album feeds out from it and back into it. And so this to me feels like this is where I feel comfortable with Taylor Swift, because she's great at coming up with a concept and executing it. She's clearly demonstrated across a lot of her records that she knows how to define an album and then have the songs reflect that. I mean, we talked about 1989 like fairly recently, and that to me is one of the most sort of conceptually, you know, immaculately conceived albums that she's made. That this is that kind of conceptual realization in this phase of Taylor's career where everything is so personalized, everything is so intimate, everything is so direct without always being direct. And this is the kind of exact product of that I would expect. That said, there are some songs I like more than others, but really I think the weakness of this album, you know, in comparison to the weaknesses of other Taylor albums, is that sometimes it makes its point redundantly. Like it'll make the point that it's making through a series of different songs that kind of don't need all to exist in this space. And I'm just talking about the album, the main album. In fact, I should say this, we should establish this on the record as well, because there is the Tortured Poets Department, which is a 16-song album that Taylor Swift released on the 19th of April. And there is also the Tortured Poets Department, The Anthology, which is a 31-song album that Taylor Swift also released very shortly after the Tortured Poets Department on the same evening, that includes the Tortured Poets Department, but is also more than that. So that's how I view this.
Making it way more complicated than you need to.
I didn't do that. Taylor Swift did that. And I'm just living in that world. So look, and a lot of the thoughts I have about the Tortured Poets Department also apply to the Tortured Poets Department, the anthology. Funny how that works, considering one contains the other. But yes, it's a well conceived and well defined concept that has a lot of emotional resonance through the songs, because they're both well written and because they have a resonance with that concept that kind of makes them tie together really, really well. Although I do think that, as has been the case, and this is not a Taylor Swift problem, this is an album's problem for a lot of artists now, there does not need to be as much of this as there is to have the emotional impact that is desired, and that the album does have in its strongest moments. That is a boring criticism though, because it's such a common one. So I'm not going to really go back to it again. I'm just going to say it now. It's a really good album. It's grown on me. I think that a lot of people, and we can talk about this as well, a lot of people came into this with a kind of preconception because there was a leak, and the leak, because of the way that social media works. And again, this isn't a Taylor Swift problem, this is a social media problem. But because of the way that leaks work, and because of the way that people consume art nowadays, certain lyrics started showing up out of context. And, you know, to be fair, all this was very much primed by Taylor Swift announcing an album that is called the Tortured Poets Department, of all things. But still, you know, people have these kind of preconceptions. And there was a bit of a frenzy that kind of happened as this leak happened and these lyrics dropped. And Rhiannon, you'll be better equipped to talk about this than me, where people were very much, I think, forming an idea of what this album was, and even forming an opinion about it before they had properly engaged with it. And that's, you know, that's also something that people do on social media a lot. But I do think it has harmed this album, or at least it's had an impact on this album that I think has caused people not to really engage with it in the way that it deserves, which is true of which is not like, which that would be true of any album that this had happened to. But what I really mean is that I think there is more to this than that. And I think it's a better album and it deserves better than the treatment it has gotten because of that. You know, that could have happened. This album could have had any level of quality. This album could have been the worst album she'd ever made. And that still would have happened the way that it happened. But I think that the fact that there is a lot of good stuff on this album and that I think it's a really well conceived record means that I do feel a little bit of an extra pang of it's a damn shame that it kind of got clouded up in this. And you could make the argument to some extent that, you know, in calling the album Tortured Poets Department and kind of leaning into all of these played up aspects of the melodrama of it all, that was inevitable because of that decision that Taylor had made. But still, you know, that doesn't take away the fact that an album should be evaluated on its own merits. And I think that Tortured Poets Department is a very good album.
One thing that I did see a lot about in the initial rollout of Tortured Poets is that a lot of people were saying that it was too lore heavy, and if you didn't know Taylor Swift, you weren't going to understand it. But I think that's more true of Midnight's.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might be a lot of
Yeah.
why you didn't like it as much as someone like me did, because a lot of that album I feel was intentional rollout for Eras Tour. There was a lot of references to other things. The entirety of there being a song named Karma was an Easter egg for Taylor Swift fans specifically. It's just, I think if we're talking about a lore heavy album, that is Midnight's. Whereas I think Tortured Poets is a lot more cut dry. This is what it is.
I definitely, listening to this album, there were many more instances, not just because there are more songs, but just like averaging across the number of songs. There were more instances where I felt an emotional connection with Taylor Swift on this album than I did with
Most
Midnight.
definitely.
Honestly, probably as many times as that I felt an emotional connection with Taylor as on other records, like maybe, I don't know, Evermore or whatever. I look, there are reasons why I think the album itself is better or worse than other albums, but I can't deny that the best sort of half of this album, I guess, is just stellar, like really good and really affecting and demonstrates really well what Taylor Swift is good at in terms of writing about those emotions and those feelings and that experience without getting too bogged down in all of the accumulated lore and all of the accumulated sort of history and stuff. These are songs that I think you could play to someone who has no real connection with Taylor Swift or maybe never even heard a Taylor Swift record before, and they could understand the points that each of these songs are making and the emotional place that they're coming from, because they stand on their own like that. So that's the kind of thing that's sort of weird about talking about it in terms of the way that it's been presented with the lead up to it and all of this sort of lore stuff, all of these specific heartbreaks, these specific partners and ex-partners, and then the album itself, which doesn't need any of that information to exist on its own two legs.
I think my biggest issue with how it was received initially or in the first couple days was simply in that a lot of the people reviewing it or talking about it did have that preconceived idea of what it was going to be, or have such a strong opinion of or against Taylor that none of the reviews that we were seeing were actually genuine. A lot of them were more leaning into how they felt as Taylor Swift as a person more than how the album they were supposed to be reviewing.
A lot of people are like in culture in general, I guess, are just sort of oversaturated with this one person. And here's the thing, right, is I don't think that's something. I don't think we should blame artists for releasing a lot of music. No one gets angry at Marquis Smith, rest in peace, of The Fall, or Robert Pollard of Guided by Voices because they've released, 70 albums in the last 40 years. That's just kind of a part of their character. The tiredness with Taylor Swift, I think, when I talk about 80% of culture that's not the Taylor Swift stans nor the Taylor Swift hardcore antis, is exhausted with Taylor Swift's presence, like omnipresence in pop culture. And it's not a personal resentment of Taylor Swift. It's just like, I wish that there was just less of this. Everyone's these 80% of people that I do think are the majority of people are fully on board with her, re-recording and re-releasing project because it has a lot of, good reasons to existing as well as being artistically interesting. And of course, believes that artists should, be able to release records and have careers and all that kind of stuff. It is just one of those things where none of this is the fault of Taylor. It's just a kind of natural byproduct of one person's omnipresence in pop culture. It creates an exhaustion. It creates a sense of that when the next thing is announced so soon after the last thing of like, oh God, I just give me a break. Give me 5 minutes. So for me, it's like with every new Taylor album at this point, I have to overcome that before I can sit down and listen to the album and be like, okay, I'm ready for it. I have to
I think you
overcome
and I
that.
had the exact same process with this album where we're just like, I am literally just going to stay as far away from this as possible until the exact precise moment where I say, I'm in the mood to listen to this. And
Yeah.
that is exactly what we did, and we were much better off for it.
So I think a lot of the discourse is fatigue with the Taylor Swift phenomenon. And very little of it really has anything to do with the music. Very little of it engages with the music. And that's understandable because a lot of people only have the time and motivation to listen to the music that they want to listen to. Of course, the problems can come when it is people who are, you know, trying to speak authoritatively on the music, but are also coming from this perspective of like, well, I was exhausted going into this. I'm forcing myself through this, and I am already in a bad mood because of its existence.
And I think something that did not help all of that is that the sound of the record did inform a lot of the discussion here, mainly because of her continuing her collaborations with some producers that she's been working with since 2020. And you know who they are. We all
Yes,
know who they are.
yes,
And one thing I think that all three of us are very united on is that we're very also tired about the way people talk about Jack Antonoff. And I just want to say right out the gate that when I went in to listen to Tortured Poets Department, because for as much as I tried to stay away from the conversation around it, I inevitably got a bunch of shit that got spoiled, leaked to me ahead of time. I was expecting something that sounded sedate. I was expecting something that sounded closer to Midnight's. I was expecting something that sounded like it was in a distinctly less tangible place for Taylor Swift. This is a point where her cultural saturation is big, but at the same time, the art that she's making, a lot of it is a little bit more frivolous. And I mean, that's been no better defined by the fact that this is a long ass album. And I think that there's a lot of charm to that. But the sound itself of this album, I must say, I think is some of the most buoyant production that she's had on a record. I haven't felt like Taylor's music has had this much of a kick to it since, I mean, maybe 1989, honestly. There are moments on here where I feel like there's a bit more dynamism than this is being given credit for, I guess, where we're having a little bit more, loud, quiet stuff, where we're having a little bit more like big choruses and just sort of like really like sharply written hooks. Like everything that Taylor has displayed in the past as like a fundamentally strong pop songwriter is also here. I feel like it's a very notable strength of hers that when she's burrowing into this myopic side of her, this side of her that's a bit more distinctly songwritery, but she's not losing the touch of what makes her music so effective and so special. It's neutered slightly by the structure, in my opinion, just because it's not quite like the palettes of both halves of this album don't quite feel as diverse as they should for a 2 hour long experience. But I still find the sounds here to be the most invigorating they've been since Folklore and Evermore.
yeah. I wanted to jump in with this as well, because this is kind of something that I had to. That was big difference between when I first heard this through earpods at work and then when I listened to it a second time with headphones at home, which is that this is some of the best production I think that Jack Antonoff has ever given her. I think that there's a lot of kick to this record. There's a lot of sharpness to the synthesizers and stuff. Look, it is, I think, again, a thing where the length hinders it a little bit, because I think this would be easier to perceive on a macro level if the album just were shorter. But that, again, that is set aside, because I said I wasn't going to go back to that critique. It's a really vibrant sounding record. I think the thing is that the subject matter and the things that the songs are about are so more often kind of downcast and downbeat, and kind of in this sort of singer-songwriter mode of talking about kind of personal experiences, or conveying personal stories, that it can be it's not a record that's going to light up a party, right? It's not a record that's going to hit the radio. It's one of Taylor's least radio friendly albums, I would say. So it's interesting, right? It's easy to listen to it, and I think kind of feel a sense of vacancy and kind of fatigue and sameness, because there is very little of it that leaps out at you, and you maybe have a certain set of expectations from the biggest pop artist in the world as to how the music will sound. But I do think that if you sit down and listen to this with headphones, it sounds great. Some songs I think work better than others. I think that there's a lot going on musically in the song Florida that I just don't quite think works. For instance, just to pick an example out of the air. But the majority of the record I think sounds really, really good.
I've been getting into Florence and the Machine very, very deeply recently. And I was, excited to see her work with Taylor. And that moment on the album really kind of perplexed me, because it's like the chorus of Florida starts and then stops immediately after 3 seconds, and you're just like, whoa, 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 wait, what? It's like this big industrial clanging that's just like, whoa, and then the hook is delivered, and you're like, whoa, and then it's just like, and we're back to the verses, and I'm like,
It's
oh,
kind of just like, let's
whoa.
use a drum machine to give this song some sudden impact that it doesn't necessarily otherwise feel like it justifies. It just feels a little bit like there's
And the
some
verses
shortcuts.
are solid for the
Yeah.
record. Really
And I like Florence Welch on this album. I'm going to be
Yes.
honest and say that I don't even mind Post Malone on this album. Amazed as I
Yes.
am to be saying that myself. I could have done with him not being on Fortnight, but I get why he's on there, and I
Yeah.
don't think that he hinders the song for me in the way that he hindered Blue Jeans or whatever the fucking Beyonce song was.
Levi
Yeah,
jeans, something like
fuck
that.
off.
No.
I still have night terrors about that eating ass line he had. Anyway, so Florida, a weird place to start, because it's like one of my least favorite songs. But yeah, I feel like I should take a step back though and ask you, Rhiannon, if you have any kind of thoughts on the Jack Antonoff question and all of this sort of stuff, like how the record sounds, and the choice to continue collaborating with Antonoff and Dester. As a Swiftie, like, do you kind of long for her to kind of have a new kind of creative muse to change the way that her music sounds, or are you like, no, girl, you found your niche, keep at it? Because I can see cases for both perspectives. I really can. I think this album makes a really strong case for why continuing to work with Jack Antonoff and Aaron Dessner is not necessarily something that's going to limit Taylor's creative potential. But I obviously can understand why some people are just like, I just ready for her to kind of pull the rug and make a complete change to how she sounds.
I'll talk about them both separately, because I do have like opinions on both of them, and I feel like the perception of both of them is not the same.
Definitely not.
When it comes to Jack, a lot of people, including Swifties, cannot stand his production. I fucking love it. I think it's awesome. I most songs that he has touched, I love, and that's just what it is. I can't change that. A lot of people, especially Swifties, think that he is hurting her sound. But the point that I like to come back at that with is, this is a woman that is going out of her way and taking so much time that she does not need to re-record the entire first half of her discography. Do you really think she's going to let one man make something that she doesn't want to make?
My only thing with the Antonoff stuff is, to me, it's not about the fact that she's working with him. Like, I don't give a shit. It's about the songs and the albums.
Yes.
And like, for instance, to draw like okay, we should make as a bit of context here, the vast majority of the Tortured Poets department is produced by Jack Antonoff, and the vast majority of the extra material on the anthology is produced by Aaron Dessner. That's just kind of broadly how this has ended up clustering. There's some Antonoff songs on the anthologies stuff. There's some Dessner songs on the main album, if you want to think of it that way. But that's
Largely
like
an even split.
if I compare this to Folklore, for instance, when I think of the sonic palette of that album, it's so like defined by the way that Aaron Dessner records the sound of a piano or the sound of an acoustic guitar, which is just different to how Jack Antonoff records them. And when I listen to Folklore, a record I love, I do find myself drawn in generally more by those songs that Dessner produces because of the way he produces. I'm able to get immersed more in the album's atmosphere in those moments. Broadly speaking, it's not to say I don't like the Antonoff songs on the album. I do. It's just like the atmosphere that Aaron Dessner creates on that record feels like it's more of a piece with that record's identity, basically. With the Tortured Poets department, Jack Antonoff's kind of the perfect person to produce the vast majority of this record, I think, because it's someone that Taylor trusts very deeply and has worked with very frequently, and so allows her to have to think less about that side of things, the engineering side of things, the sound construction side of things, because she's so focused on the songwriting and making these songs, crafting these songs lyrically. Like that's such a, I'm not saying that she's ever less focused on one thing than the other, or she's like half-assing one thing. I'm just saying that this album is so focused on the writing. And so allowing Jack Antonoff to do what he does, which is take some really insular writing and give it a context that allows it to kick a little bit more and feel a little bit more accessible than it would if it was a fully Aaron Dessner produced thing, which would sound very maudlin and very samey. As much as I love Aaron, Jack's the right choice to kind of sculpt most of what this is, because it gives it counterpoint, and he's really, really good at that.
Yeah.
It's really hard though for me to talk about either of these two producers in any kind of absolutes, because they're like any good producer needs to be malleable, but also every producer has a style and they are chosen for their style. And to me, it's very clear why these two men were chosen. It's very clear why they have recorded a lot of the songs that they have been chosen to record, and a lot of the identities of the songs are, to some degree informed by the decision to have this person record them in that way and give them that kind of atmosphere. So yeah, I don't have any issue with either of them, and I do wish that more of the conversation would talk a little bit more about not just how they sound or how they produce things, but why, but the songs themselves as well. Like, I feel like a lot of the conversation gets lost, and maybe that's what's happening right now. So maybe we should move on from it. But I did want to acknowledge it though, because it's a thing that comes up in conversations around the music that Taylor Swift puts out now, and I feel like it's often more of a distraction than anything really constructive. I also think a lot of people who talk about production don't really. For me, actually, I'm going to be honest here. I think a lot of people who talk about production don't know what they're fucking talking about, honestly, and don't really.
You're just correct here. That's just
don't really
true.
listen to music. If you're listening to an album, all due respect, I do this every day. But if you're just listening to consuming all your music through earpods or whatever, and then going online to be like, here's authoritatively what I think about the production of this, you're not even like listening properly. There's so much that goes on in engineering a record and in mixing things. You can't appreciate that stuff if you're not like actually sitting down and listening to it properly. That's my elitist take on production. I think a lot of people just say the word, "Oh, the production's bad," and like, what are you saying? That's like saying, like, criticizing a movie because the fucking filming's bad or something. Like what are you talking about? There's like 500 things you could mean, and you don't know what you mean. Anyway,
Aaron, who has been referred to by Taylor as her musical soulmate. And every time that I hear a song that they did together, I understand more and more just how much she means that. I think that every song that I've heard him produce for Taylor has been some of the most beautiful songs that I've ever heard in my life. If I were to go sit down and make a list of all of my absolute favorite Taylor Swift songs, I can almost guarantee you that at least 9 out of the 10 are produced by Aaron Dessner. I think a lot of people don't like that sound because a lot of Swifties, you know, prefer one album over the other or whatnot. And the ones that like things like Reputation the most cannot stand the Aaron Dessner production. And as someone who holds the Folklore and Evermore albums above everything and anything, it works for me. I love it.
Well, you're not going to get any flack for that on this podcast
No,
where we've
yeah.
hosted an entire national retrospective. But I mean, like, there is a distinct difference that I feel like, and also it isn't appreciated that the both halves of the album do, in my opinion, at least, sound very distinctly different, even though Aaron and Jack on albums like Folklore, you can tell who produces what if you're familiar with their material, but it's more like they feel like they're trying to meet Taylor rather than Taylor trying to meet them.
Right.
And that's very much still the case here, but I still feel like there's a concerted effort on Taylor's part to almost make a left brain and right brain out of the two halves of this album's sound. And on that note, I just want to say I largely agree with the points about Jack Antonoff and the front half of the album. That said, what makes my thoughts on this so fucking complicated is that the half of the album that is dropped after the record, I have more fondness for collectively. And I mean, it's going to be no surprise that, yes, I like the production style of Dessner more, but to me, it's like what Ryley was pointing out with how Jack is an adaptive producer, and I feel like that's what he's doing on here, and he's doing it well on that front half. I think that the first part of the record to me is the more consistent part of this record. This is a bit more inconsistent. I don't think this is what's going to inevitably shoot my credibility in the foot here, is that I don't think this album has a bad song, contrary to what a lot of people online are talking about like this. However, the lowest points of the album's songwriting and the ways in which this is unwieldy and a bit repetitive on occasion makes these songs suffer the most for me, even though instrumentally, I think they never dropped the ball, like, even once. It's very strange that the ultimate comparison that I came down to after digesting this album, listening to it a little bit more, is that it's kind of like, and I know that, like, even comparing one pop star to another pop star is kind of glib and unimaginative, just to be like, this in the book. I'm just trying to use shorthand to explain how I feel, in that this whole thing reminded me a lot of Lana Del Rey. And I'm not saying that Taylor, like, when this conversation occurs online, people automatically are going to read that statement as me interpreting Taylor trying to make music like Lana. And I'm like, no, I'm just saying that this more intimate approach that does not abandon pop-centric sensibilities, and specifically what it reminds me of is the back-to-back punch of Chemtrails Over the Country Club and Blue Bannisters, in that it's kind of like she released those two albums in one package on here, where with Chemtrails, the first part, like that album, regardless of my feelings on it, Jack Antonoff production, that album is very much Lana sort of continuing to deliver what she's been delivering in this era of her career. And whether or not you're sick of that sound more or less determines how you will feel about that record. And then Blue Bannisters is the very self-conscious attempt to address a lot of what this artist thinks people are saying about her and her music. And I do feel like it's like those two core ideas put together and then kind of distributed into this 31 song long album, but also divided in half. And this is a double album mess that, again, it's like when we talked about Beyonce album, I love mess. I think Midnight's is a more well-rounded, more well-curated, and just like it's a more satisfying album to me. But the ways in which this is a less satisfying album experience make it a more interesting musical project. So that's what I gravitate towards. It's just that all the choices that are made here don't necessarily feel like they have the most specific of intentions, and that's where people like myself and I don't want to speak for you, Ryley, but maybe the people who value the album experience are just going to have a bar for entry with this in a way that Taylor's music has just never presented before.
It's interesting. You know, listening to you talk about this, I'm becoming aware that we've definitely experienced this album differently, because up until about 3 days ago, I hadn't heard the anthology disc, and that was a purposeful choice. Like, part of this is just my own kind of stubbornness. But also like was listening to this album. I've been listening to this album a lot over the last few weeks, and I've been listening to the Torture Poets Department, the 16-song album, aware of this anthology thing, but really in my mind treating it only as this sort of ancillary extra, like a B-sides disc. And I know that's kind of unfair, but also like there's just so much music here, and I was not like mentally prepared to like get myself fully around 31 songs. So for me, it was just kind of like I I'm going to treat the original album that was released as the album, and then I'll get to the rest of it. And so you're talking very eloquently about the an album of two halves, and the way that this half of the album does this and this half of the album does that. Whereas my perspective and my experience with it is a little bit more like the album to me is this the 16-song thing that I've experienced, and then these extra bonus tracks like flesh out, reinforce, give an alternate perspective maybe, or an alternative view of what the album could have been if the album was kind of shaped in this way. Instead, it's like an alternate look. It's been very difficult for me to view the anthology disc as the second half of the album, even if I understand that that's kind of how it's being presented. That was kind of my approach for the vast majority of my time with this album. Now, I was always intending to get to the second disc and give it its due, and I have. I've listened to the second disc 3 times, and there's a lot of songs I really like on it. I don't feel that it works as a second half, and I don't feel that it works as a standalone project. It is an assemblage of songs that are all thematically unified with the main album, but for more or less understandable reasons, I can see why the vast majority of these were not put on the main album. I might feel differently if, to me, side B worked as a front to back album. I don't really think it does. I think it has some great songs on it. I think they are mostly on the first half of that back disc, because I think it spins its wheels a little bit around sort of Thank You Amy through to the Bolter. Like those are mostly good
Ooh.
songs, but
Oh, I have a feeling Rhiannon and I have thoughts about that streak of tracks, because there's a couple in there that I'm gonna defend with my life.
hey, and go for it. I don't. Well, actually, I kind of think "Thank You, Amy" is bad, but I don't think any of the other ones are bad.
I for the record, that is my least favorite song on either side of the album, and it's because I don't want this to come across how it's going to sound, but I'm just going to say it anyway. I just kind of think this song is beneath Taylor Swift.
Yes,
Um,
thank you. I think
I
that too. I think
I
it
think
runs.
I think the way you're framing it is what makes you think that.
No, I get that, and it's very much worth pointing out here that my opinion does stem from the very obviously presented context of the capitalization in the title and the idea of like, oh, who do we think this is about? And the album's concept is trying to obscure muses. The album's concept is trying to add the idea of like multiple meanings. And there are totally valid readings as to this being an intentional red herring, and the concept of red herrings being Taylor Swift's bread and butter. Oh, of course I do.
No, I'm with
But
you, Jake. I'm with you, Jake. I think
no,
whether it's like whether the "Thank You, Amy" capitalization is a direct nod to who the song's about or a bit of misdirection, either
yes,
way, I shouldn't have to either like be confronted with that or have to choose to purposefully ignore it. It runs so
yeah,
opposite to the way
it's
the rest of the album functions.
I understand its inclusion. It's just not like, I'll just put it this way. I don't even necessarily think it's bad. It's just not something that really particularly interests me. And that could be more my problem than the album's problem. I'm absolutely willing to admit that. But partially it is because, I mean, you do say that the second half of it, the back half specifically, might get a little wheel spinning. And I agree that the parts of the album that I deem the weakest are here. That said, there's a consistency that Thank You, Amy interrupts. That's why it's
Sure.
what bothers me personally, especially because I love songs like I Look in People's Windows and The Prophecy. And I love I Look in People's Windows because I Look in People's Windows and The Prophecy feel like sequels to Anti-Hero, almost an elaboration on Anti-Hero's thesis in a way that takes that to its logical and ultimately quite melodramatically tragic extreme. And I like the way that she mines that on songs like this really, really well. And I also want to say that a song that I have not heard hide nor hair of people talking about in any context, even from the pro-Taylor camp, that I think is excellent, is Peter. I have not heard a single person talk about this song, and frankly,
Except
I
for
think,
me.
except for you, because this song is fucking heartbreaking. Like, it doesn't hurt that I think that the moments that sting the most for me are on the second half, and no better than on the crown jewel of the album for me, and why I'm more eager to sort of view it as a double album, is because, like, I think that I like that Ryley and I came at this from these two perspectives, because its transient status as not really definitively either is going to lead to people engaging with it in one of those two ways, more than likely, unless you're able to specifically tailor
So
your
can we
approach.
add my third approach
No,
of seeing this as
I-
an entire album?
I was gonna say that is the best perspective to probably have here. But that being said, it's why I'm okay with viewing it as a double album, is because I feel like so much of the essential material from whatever you want to call this phase, rollout, or whatever is on here, specifically on the first song on the second half, which is The Black Dog. To
Great song.
me,
Great song.
the crown jewel of the album, and the moment where, like, I was like, all right, this is gonna be the second disc. I'm gonna, evaluate this for what it is and deem whether or not this, needed to be here. And I was immediately greeted with the best justification for treating this as a whole thing possible. That being said, it's sort of that's sort of the key thing, is that a lot of how you interact with this album, if you can get past the surface level veneer of Taylor Swift's celebrity, it's going to depend on how you consume it, how you view it more than anything. And I think that's why I found this weirdly refreshing, is that once I got away from the internet, once I, got away from all those bitches in my ears telling me that Taylor Swift sucks, and I just listened to it, I was like, this album is provoking more thoughts in me about what the concept of an album is, about the concept of a double album, the idea of pop stars making double albums, and the way they age and the way they're received. It made me think about the delivery in which we consume music in a lot of different ways, that is informed by the other part of this video, inevitably. But I love that, because even though I don't feel like every choice that's made here has a specific, like, defined intention that would appeal to me, they have an effect, maybe not an intention, but they have something that makes me feel like Taylor cared about every single song on this project, which is what makes this, to me, way more excusable than just dropping a big long ass album to gain streaming. And Taylor Swift's a smart woman. I'm sure she knows that she's doing herself plenty of favors with this release model, but I simply do not buy that this is any less effort than her other work in so far in this decade.
I want to clarify a couple of things, and I'll throw to Ree, because I know you have thoughts on this as well. I don't disagree with viewing it as a double album, or think that's wrong in any way. It's just not how I happened to do it for the majority of the time I've spent with this. And it's also just like, I think that viewing this as a single 31 song album of two halves kind of it just isn't like the superior version, I guess, of this record, even though I think a lot of great songs exist in that anthology. I kind of wish she'd only released one version. Uh, like I kind of wish she had, I don't know what I wish, to be honest, because I definitely think that the single version with the first 16 songs is superior, but also like I'm glad that we have the other 15 songs. I'm glad they exist. Um, I'm gonna make an analog for this that I think you'll like, Jake. Which
Oh,
is
please
that
tell me to do what I think you're gonna do.
I kind of view this a little bit like The Fragile by Nine Inch Nails.
What?
Um, which is like that's totally a double album cleaved into two discs. There's even some structural stuff that kind of mirrors parts of the first disc and the second disc. I also just think that album fundamentally works better if you just listen to the first disc. And again, I'm super glad the second disc exists. Some fucking killer songs in the second disc. Into the Void, one of my favorite Nine Inch Nails songs. I just think that the second disc has a little bit of a wheel spinning quality to it, where it's sort of like reinforcing points the first disc already made so much more potently, and doing that in a slightly different style as well. Like there's even a Thank You Amy analog with Starfuckers on the second
Yeah, I
disc.
was gonna say.
So
This
like
is the
there's
Marilyn Manson diss track. I
there's
I will
like
say I love that you made that comparison because it is the best analog that I've come up where or that has been presented to me and makes me understand my thoughts on this album in that I kind of think the opposite of you is that I think the most value I get out of this project is with its double album format, and I think the single album format for the original version of the album is distinctly weaker for me. Like I like the double album of Tortured Poets more than Midnight's, and I like the single album less than Midnight's, if that makes any sense.
I think I agree with that. After listening to the original 16 songs, I had more mixed feelings than I think I've had on a Taylor Swift album in a very long time.
Yeah, your tone was very skeptical.
I was really unsure. I was like, maybe this is going to have to grow on me. Like, there were a couple songs immediately that I loved, like Who's Afraid of Little Old Me and Clara Bow and So
Clara
On
Bow's
London.
so good.
But I was like, man, I don't know how many of these I'm going to like. I don't know how many of these I, have a really strong connection with. Obviously the connections were there, but some of them I were just like, eh. That being said, when the second half dropped and I listened to it, something Jake and I talked about, there was a lot that was going around on Twitter, is that this is the closest that we as a fandom will ever get to Woodvale, which is a theory that Taylor Swift fans had, that there was going to be a third album in the Folkmore cycle. I'm sorry.
I was wondering what Woodvale could possibly mean, and now it makes total sense. Yeah.
So listening to that, like once I got to the Albatross, I was sitting here and I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I was like, oh my God, it's the return of Evermore. I've never been this excited. And then, you listen to the rest of it and everything that didn't click with me about the first half clicked. And I'm so in love with so many tracks on this. Like especially, well, yeah, no, the entire back half, I don't think there's a song that I really dislike. I appreciate the entirety of the 31 songs so much because I feel like it gives a good balance, not only for the fans that like the more pop synth stuff, but also the ones that do like that more stripped back Folkmore sound. I feel like the second half wraps up the first half so well.
Let's talk about some highlights because I have some specific thoughts on some specific songs
Sure.
all across. Down Bad is where I started to actually really get on board with the front half of the record with the bass album. Is that to me, that's when all of her strengths kind of materialize. Like I think that the title track is also solid, but Fortnight and My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys feel I guess on the less substantive side for me of the record. I really, really fucking love Down Bad, So Long London, and But Daddy I Love Him. I think these are like the songs that I'm probably going to think about the most when I think about the identity of what this album is and what it does best, frankly. I think that like there's some more ambitious moments on here, like Love of My Life, for instance, which I think go over really well. Some longer moments that are a bit more just kind of prosaic and dense and sort of abandon pop sensibilities a little bit just to be purely songwriterly. And that is something that I really, really dig.
I do want to point out something that I think may not have clicked.
Hmm.
She never says "love of my life" in that song.
Oh, okay. That's true. That's true. I was just trying
That's
to
also what I've been calling it in my head, Jake.
Yeah.
So don't,
just
don't
because
feel
I
too
don't
bad.
want to say
Because I don't.
LOL.
I was like, yeah, I'm not. How can I get on here and say "lommel" on camera?
Lommel.
Um,
That's true. But also, I think that those moments go over very well. And there are moments where I think, you know, this is a really like this album. I was led to believe that this album was going to be much more in one mode than it ended up being. And that's because of songs like Florida or I Can Do It with a Broken Heart, for instance, or The Alchemy. Clara Bow, I think, is a really great ending. But to me, the songs I want to like single out are that like I kind of think that So High School is brilliant.
yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm
Okay,
gonna get to that too.
I love the idea of Taylor Swift essentially. It's kind of like what I got spiritually out of Taylor's version of the song 15. And that when I listen to the original version of 15, it's kind of like, yeah, I'm definitely listening to a child's understanding of what it means to grow up. However, when you have the Taylor's version of that and you have the added maturity of Taylor's voice and getting older, it inherently lends a sadness and a maturity to the performance that makes that song a lot better, in my opinion. And this is basically that, but instead of from a vocal perspective, it's from a songwriting perspective.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
So High School is Taylor Swift, as of right now, going back and writing a Taylor Swift song from when she was 15 or 16 years old, but with her updated songwriterly sort of acumen. And I love that. I think that's awesome.
I feel like So High School is also a song where she explores this certain sound that I really, really am desperate for her to explore more.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, so I had a lot of thoughts. This is actually one probably top 3 across the whole 31 songs for me. I really like this song. Taylor taps into something that I relate to very deeply here, and that it gets more relatable the older you get, which is how, and again, you don't have to feel great about this, but it can just genuinely feel really life affirming to be able to tap into a younger and more immature version of yourself, or to be able to enjoy the kind of freedom of being able to kind of step back into a more adolescent headspace where you just, where things are just less serious, and you're able to kind of enjoy, you know, not necessarily being an idiot, but like you just enjoy
the frivolity of life.
Yeah, exactly. And like the way that Taylor does that in terms of like a song about choosing to do that in the context of a relationship, it just is a really, really fun angle on that. I think it's a really funny song. I think it's got a lot of humor and wit to it that I find really relatable and funny. And also, yeah, this is also a great like little counterexample to the whole idea of you know, Dessner and Antonoff as kind of producers with a very singular sound who are deployed for very singular purposes, and that this is a very different kind of song for an Aaron Dessner production. Like it sounds like a late 90s, early 2000s like radio pop song. I think it's just the sound of the guitars. It sounds like the kind of thing we could have been talking about in our One Hit Wonders video. Like it reminds me of like that new radical sort of era of pop music. It's kind of got a dreamy sound to it, like it's almost got a little bit of a power pop sound to it, even though the song is not power pop. It's like so different in a really fun way, and I really, really, really love that about it.
I want to say that on this sort of section of the album, like I think that, but for the record, Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus and How Did It End are both incredibly fucking solid songs. And I just love that there's very specific songwriting conceits on this album in a way that's not just like this is a song or this is a story. It's just like, again, Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus or something like Robin feel like they are songs that are delivered with a very specific, very sharp intent, and I like that a lot.
Yes.
And also, after So High School, there's also I Hate It Here, which to me is one of the most cathartic songs on the album and one of the most just like ones where the instrumentation just absolutely fucking adds to the just like bam quality that it's got. And yeah, Amy, but like I Look in People's Windows and The Prophecy, I think is just like a 1-2 punch that I'm utterly fucking in love with. And again, Cassandra after that is like maybe a bit thematically repetitive, sure, but still a fantastic sequencing choice in terms of like this idea of, you know, being there's the almost like a tragic fable way in which Taylor paints her ability to sort of channel her artistry on here that sort of leads into this leg that I find very coherent narratively.
Mm. Yeah, some songs I love that you mentioned here. It seems like we're just talking about the second disc first, so I'm fine with that, I guess. It's how we've ended up. Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus is another favorite of mine. I just think it's a really sharply written song. It sounds really good. I think that the chorus is devastating, and I love it. I Hate It Here has, I think, one of the funniest lines on the whole album, which is that line at the end where she's like, quick, tell me something awful, like you're a poet trapped inside the body of a finance guy. Which I just found, I literally laughed out loud when I heard that the first time. I thought that was really funny. So yeah, that those are great songs. I already seconded what you said about the Black Dog earlier, which just I will admit for the misgivings I have about how these last 15 songs work as a structural second half. There are things that work. You know, Taylor still knows what she's doing. She's still constructing things in a purposeful way, and that kicks the door down on in the second half really well. I'm also going to say that I'm going to get you back even more than that song. I think that
Yeah,
an absolute
I
killer
fucking
track.
I love how utterly fucking demented this song is.
I,
Love.
my note for this song is that it's blank space older sister.
A blank
People
space is older sister that got committed to an insane asylum.
I just like, I remember there was a moment on Twitter or wherever where people were like talking about this song as being like, well, she's ripping off Olivia Rodrigo. And like,
Let's get away from this.
Fucking whatever,
Let's get away
man.
from this unless you want me to scream.
it's okay. I just want to get this off my chest very briefly,
We're on your
which is
side.
like, you're not, did you hear the song? Like, you see the song title, it shares a similarity with an Olivia Rodrigo song title. They could not sound more different. Like, they're very different songs. They just have slightly similar titles. Like, what are you talking about? And they're both great, so I don't fucking care. They're both great. And even if she was ripping off Olivia Rodrigo on that last album, good for her. That's a fucking good thing to rip off. I wish she would. Anyway, no, great song. Yeah, I think that you know, just generally tracks 17 through to 22, 23 is a great run. While we're talking about back half standouts, I do think that with songs like The Prophecy, Cassandra and Peter and The Bolter, like they're good songs. I definitely think they're good and they have real high moments in them. They do feel a little bit like each of them is a kind of song that Taylor has written before, I think. And so that just limits the height to which I can feel about it. But they're all good songs. One of my stealth favorites, though, is Robin, which literally makes me cry. Like this song actually brought me to tears this morning. This is a song actually, and I don't feel uncomfortable saying this as well because it literally shares its name with Aaron Dessner's young son Robin. It is literally, but it's a song about seeing a young child having fun and thinking about, and it's actually really hard to write a song about like being an adult and viewing the innocence of youth and the bittersweetness of that because it's really easy for it to just come across like you're trying to really bluntly make a very two-dimensional cynical point about how, you know, growing up, you know, makes you cold and all that kind of thing. And Robin doesn't do that. It alludes to and situates like Taylor's complicated feelings watching this young child play, like in her life and in that sense with which, yeah, well, your innocence does go away when you grow up. But the song is more about like how we try to protect children from that and how we try to deliberately hide the ugliness of the world from them and the kind of complicated emotional like meaning of that. The fact that we actually deliberately obscure and maybe even lie or manipulate children in a certain way to protect them, like that's a really interesting idea the song kind of touches on very briefly. It's not like the whole thing's about that, but it alludes to how we choose how our children view the world to a certain extent, and the power that holds. And the ultimate message being, we have such a duty to protect children, and we have such a duty to kind of nurture and foster and ensure that they're not like damaged by what we allow them to be exposed to. And all of that's subtextual, all of that's kind of beneath the surface, but it's a beautiful song about the fragility of childhood, the fragility of a child, and the importance of um of care, of genuine care for children. And it just brought tears to my eyes as well. Like it really did. Like that's the one moment on the album where I like completely became emotionally undone. It came out of nowhere for me. So I really wanted to highlight that song because it's a deep cut. Most people are gonna just kind of skip past it. Well, not skip past it, but they're gonna kind of like, there's 31 songs. You can't think deeply about everything. But that one I just really wanted to highlight because it really moved me.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, the manuscript is a beautiful ending
The
as well.
manuscript is a prime example of why I can't view the second half as anything other than the second half of the album to me, because
Yeah,
the
exactly.
manuscript is an addendum to this whole experience to me. It's the bow on top of the package. It is basic. Not only, I mean, like, the manuscript effectively is Taylor Swift's thesis for why she does what she does and why she's doing what she's doing. And in that respect, it's the most like directly about her thing on this album, other than, the lyrics that do directly, reference named people from her life. But to me, this is so much more revealing and interesting and inherently kind of a complex and not entirely healthy emotional dynamic to have. And that's an interesting way to have this be explored. I think that you could effectively argue that the manuscript is capping off this phase of Taylor Swift, like, that started in 2020, is kind of ending here, and maybe we're seeing like a soft launch into something else. Like, once the Eras tour is over and once whatever comes next happens, I feel like we will view this part like right where we are now. This is where the phase ended because of a song like that.
I like that this album kind of has two endings. It has Clara
Yeah,
Bow
Clarabow is also a very effective ending.
and it has the manuscript. But what I like about both of these songs existing as endings, and again, I know I said all this stuff about my misgivings with the way the first half is packaged, but no, none of my thoughts are clear cut here. So at the same time as that, I also really like the manuscript as an ending, like you guys do. But what I like about them both existing as endings is that they're both endings to different themes of the record. The manuscript is an ending to the arc of the album that is talking about the romantic relationship aspect and the being a songwriter who chooses to, but in some ways is kind of forced to also incorporate these deeply personal and raw aspects of her life into the work that she does, and somehow come across as a professional while doing what would be for any person a really emotionally difficult task. And so the manuscript is a beautiful song at kind of drawing a bow around that, like you said, and putting a kind of full stop on that sentence. Whereas Claro Bow, which is actually my favorite song across all of both discs, is
Great song.
a song about celebrity, is a song about image, is a song about, like, it's less about the specific kind of being an artist who writes about relationships thing, and it's more about kind of being an artist who has had a career essentially their entire life, ever since they were a teenager, who hasn't really known a life outside of that, and who has had to maintain the momentum of that consistently. This need for relevance, this need to kind of be seen in a positive light, both because Taylor herself has a, on a personal level, a desire to be liked and a desire to be seen and to be loved, and that's a true feeling that she has. And also because there's a lot of pressure that's put on female celebrities and pop stars, whatever kind of niche within that you want to look at, to prove their relevance continuously, to kind of maintain their sense that they're earning the spotlight.
Answer for what we made you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Clara Bow is a beautifully written song about that feeling, the way that structurally it invokes, various different kind of, female cultural figures, and then ending on Taylor, addressing herself by name through this whole lens of the whole song being about how you're viewed, and the whole song also being, I think the whole song essentially just being like quotes, that things that other people are saying, essentially, is the way that the lyrics are structured. I think that it's just a masterful ending, and again a really intelligent piece of songwriting, that with, and I love its like morose instrumental tone with Dessner production, great choice for this kind of thing. The descending chordal pattern has a real sort of darkness to it, but also a kind of wistful longing to it. I think it's really easy to overlook the musical effect of like the chord progressions and melodies in her songs, because they can often be so simple and so recycled, but that's because they work really well, and she is working in a pop landscape, so that's what you do. I love both those songs a lot. I think they're both really, really effective. I like that the album has two endings like that. I'm just going to take a step back to the start of the album because uh, the Tortured Poets Department, the title track of this record. So I've mentioned already that my top three songs in this album include So High School and Clara Bow, and the other one is the title track of this record, which has grown on me a lot. I think is just a kind of classic Taylor Swift song. It's like I listen to this now, I'm like, this is like one of the most Taylor Swift songs, if ever Taylor Swifted, in the best way possible. Like
With a verb.
I love the song so much. Every lyric of it is just pure Taylor Swift. I think
So
that
funny.
I
Yeah.
think it's very funny. I think that the Charlie Puth line has been slightly misunderstood, including by me, because it's like, the whole point, I think, is the stupid shit you say, and how like you big up the intelligence of the person you're with, and they big up your intelligence as well when you're high and just saying utter nonsense. So the whole song is about, and this is a kind of angle that we haven't really talked about, which is that, like, the title of the album and what does it refer to, right? Like, when it initially dropped, there was a lot of people saying, oh, like, this is Taylor Swift's scathing takedown of like male patriarchal artistry and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that that's not relevant or even part of it, but like you're being silly if you're like thinking that that's not a very multifaceted title that doesn't incorporate uh a lot of different ways in which artists can behave like tortured poets. Tortured poets can be manufactured in a very departmental kind of like factory setting way. It's a great album title, I think, and it has a lot of different meanings. And restricting it to like being about petulant men, even though it certainly partially is not appreciating the full scope of what that title can do. And the song really does a great job of laying it out. It is about, it's about being in a relationship with someone who is an utterly insufferable artist, but guess what? So are you, and you feed each other. And who else decodes you? Who else could decode you? Like, I am
Who
the
else
only
could
one who can
stand?
understand you. You're reliant on me. You need, like, it's the whole thing of like celebrities, for a whole host of reasons, can only ever really date other celebrities. And part of it is just you know the sense with which it's like impossible to escape that world fully. But also part of it is just that it's impossible to really be fully understood by someone who's outside of that world. And it's a song about the active choice you make when you're choosing to be with someone who has those kinds of sort of insufferable qualities or baggage, where it's like an active choice to engage with that, and a choice to have to care and to devote yourself through that, because you know that you're in your own way just as troubled, just as niche, just as esoteric, just as full of ego. And I do think that drawing back the comparisons to say, like, you're not Dylan Thomas, I'm not Patti Smith, this isn't the Chelsea Hotel, we're modern idiots, is like a quietly perfect phrase for like what
Yes.
she's trying to get across. And yeah, I just think the song is really fucking great. Like, it's really fucking great. It's one of my favorite songs that she's made this decade, I think, because it's like, it's so perfectly captures Taylor Swift at this moment and the whole thesis of the album for me, I think. Who's gonna hold you? Like, who can hold you? This is a kind of prison that we're in, where we're limited in the kind of people that can hold us. And so that makes us more desperate to reach out for that intimacy and to get it where we can, because it's a currency for people like us, for people with the level of success that Taylor has, and that her celebrity partner in the song has. It's hard to get, and it's hard won. And I love that despite the fact that I'm nowhere near famous, I can listen to the song and feel that level of need and desperation, and how important it feels to be able to like connect with someone, even sometimes especially if the whole world is telling you that you're better than them and that you don't need them.
I think that this song gives me a perfect segue to talk about something that I was supposed to talk about like 2 hours ago and then forgot to.
Go for it.
I think this song is the first instance in this album in which Taylor is doing this thing where she is intentionally obscuring the muse of each and every song by including references that will make this person think that it's about this person, or this person think that it's about this person. And considering the idea of paternity testing her songs is something she's been trying and begging her fans and the public to stop doing since
Is that a thing they call it? Paternity testing?
I learned that, and it made me a little sick to my stomach.
That is grim.
So I think a lot of what she's doing with the way she's writing, writing about some of these people on the album is in hopes that maybe she can confuse enough people to which they'll finally shut the fuck up.
Well, that's the whole point of the song, is that it doesn't matter who it's about. The experience with everyone I've dated, all my celebrity partners or whatever, is the same, because we're all in this prison. We're all these tortured poets, and we're all limited by this life that we lead. So it doesn't matter which person it's about.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the tragedy of it and the beauty of it at the same time, is that, yeah, it is a shared experience, and it is in some ways destined to iterate again and again and again because of the machine. And I love every moment on this album. And I think one of the reasons why I connect so strongly to this first half is that I just find it really interesting and really compelling when she explores that, because it's a thing that I've struggled with her writing about before, her celebrity and that. But I actually think it's a really interesting angle from her. And it's kind of the thing that I want to hear her talk about, is that feeling and that experience of the unique way that she experiences love through the lens of being the most famous person in the world. So I think the songs that lean into that, like But Daddy, I Love Him, another huge highlight on the album for me. Who's Afraid of Little Old Me? Like, whoa, she goes off on this song. It's just incendiary.
Vigilante shit too.
The way that the song
better. I want to go into the middle of the woods and just scream that song at the top of my lungs.
Yeah.
And
it's like it's the perfect takedown of like everyone who has ever thought that they know better for Taylor, but also just like broadly anyone who's ever thought that they know better for you, especially if you're a fucking grown adult, although not limited to that as well. It's true when you're young too. Like anyone who thinks they know fully what's best for you, like this is how it feels, right? And why do you want to control me so much? Why do you want to like police my life so much? What are you afraid I'll become? And what does that say about you, that you're so invested in what I become instead of having your own life?
Don't you have better things to do?
like, of course, on the one level, like you can read it as addressing, you know, the stands of hers that are like the most intense ones, you know, the people who are, you know, doing all that kind of shit and having all this kind of like, no, Taylor needs to do this to be morally good. But it's again, it's about anyone in any context that would aim to try and kind of impose some sort of moral righteousness over her, because a lot of people do that, you know, some people who love her do that, a lot of people who hate her do that, a lot of people who should just know better than having a fucking opinion in the first place do that.
One thing I was gonna say is that I feel like this album, more than any, has recently I found it quite sobering because it has shown me in stark clarity how attentive people are when they listen to the music that they listen to. To me, this is an album that your reaction to it and the way you interact with it is very telling of how you engage with art. And I know that using this as a barometer makes me sound like I'm placing all of this importance on the album, and I'm really not. I'm just saying that it has a lot of very superficial barriers for entry that are very easy to obfuscate and move around if you just disconnect from all of that and plug into. And again, this is I feel like the point that we're trying to make here might get lost in translation because we all have broadly very positive feelings about the album. But it's that everybody is just so eager to say something that they don't end up really saying much of anything. Not to focus on that, but a lot of the songs on here do very self-consciously touch on the idea of self-perception, either directly or indirectly. And to me, this examination of that perspective, it's not something new for Taylor, but it is absolutely at its strongest here for me, and probably at its strongest on the front half. Like, I think that all of the most emotionally cathartic songs are probably on the back half for me personally, but I get the impression that for Taylor, all of the truly incendiary material is maybe on this first half. I mean, like, even though I'm not super into something like Florida, for example, that's a song that you only make when you want to just, you know, inject more vitality into the flow of your track
Or
list.
or
That
even like the smallest man who ever lived. Like, we talk about this
yes, which is
fucking song
great.
for a second. Like, just he's already dead. Like,
We've been talking a lot about diss tracks this year, and this is another addition to a litany of good ones.
Yeah.
just the absolute just venom dripping from this song. Again, especially on so many songs which have up until this point been like, again, regardless of, again, forgetting any dimensionality of like who these may or may not be about, just in terms of relationship songs about being in a relationship with an artist or with, you know, a public figure. You know, Taylor, I think, goes to great pains to kind of paint a very three-dimensional portrait of how both parties are very complicated individuals who hurt and harm each other and themselves to varying degrees as a product of their own weaknesses and insecurities. And so, having shown all that, then allows you to the basis from which to do a song like this, which is just pure fuck you, pure destruction. And that's why I like where it's placed as well so late in the album too, because it feels like a bit of really earned catharsis at this point, especially coming when it does as well. Um, like, actually, LOML going into I Can Do It With a Broken Heart's also a really great bit of sequencing as well,
Yeah, it is.
going from the like the depths of the pain to actually smiling through it on stage, and then sort of once you've smiled through it, then fully excoriating after that. You know, the getting the catharsis that you need. Really
It has a
smart bit
lot
of
of great
sequencing.
1-2 sequencing choices.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, really, I think. Yeah, I really, I think I would just cut Fresh Out the Slammer, Florida, I Can Fix Him, I guess those are probably the only songs I think that the main record would be better without. Although I'm more and more moving away from this mentality of like trying to fix albums retroactively. I kind of just want to accept them for what they are, as opposed to trying to like fan cast a better record. But those are the sort of three songs that I think are the most sort of contribute the least to the experience for me.
How about The Prophecy? We haven't really touched on that song in particular, and I would like to get your perspective on it because I think it's a key track on this, honestly.
No, I do too. I think it's going to be hard for me to talk about it without because there's the perspective of which it's written, and then how it makes me as a person feel in a way that I can relate to it. Where should I go?
I mean, if you've got an angle at all.
I can give a little angle if you want, because I have a couple of thoughts on this songs, but not like a huge amount.
You start on that off you.
I think this is one of those songs that will continue to grow on me. Again, I have spent admittedly a little bit less time with these extra songs, so I freely admit that's a limitation for me. But I do think the song has a real kind of emotion. I think if apart from the songs that I like the most on the second disc, if I were to like take those three I didn't like on the first disc, even though I just said I didn't like to do this, but if I were take the three I didn't like and swap them out, this would certainly be one of the ones I would put in, not because it's a favorite of mine, but because it definitely feels the most aligned with the ideas of the first disc. This talking about the life that Taylor has, the situation that she's kind of stuck in, the consequences of the the way that her omnipresence and her fame and her sort of industry experiences have kind of molded her in terms of the way that she views herself as a person, the way that she's viewed as an object of desire, the way that she's trusted or not trusted, wanted or not wanted. It totally fits in, I think, with all of the songs about being in those difficult relationships with other people who are also like that in their own ways. So it's a really raw song about how vulnerable Taylor feels as a consequence of all of those things, like the true genuine human needs and desires that she has, but the sense with which she feels as though so many things are a foregone conclusion, I've decided for her, are outside of her control, that she can only have a certain type of relationship now that she's had the life that she's had. And that has a real a lot of poignancy to it. Especially given all the other songs, just wanting to be able to escape the weight of the legacy you've built up, the life that you've led, all this shit, wanting to be able to define your own future, but also just to be able to exist outside of this feeling that everything is preordained for you, that you have no agency, no control, like you're boxed in. Not even as an artist, but just in terms of being as a person who wants to have like genuine connections with other people and feel happy. Like that idea that the potential for your happiness is limited in some way.
I think of the 31 songs here, I think this one is one of probably the most personal for her, just because it is such a vulnerable position to say that you're begging for someone to want to be around you, because everyone that is around her, that's a point that I can't make. I don't know her. But when you get to that kind of level of success, it feels like most likely anyone that's around you is not around you because they want to be, but because of what you are, not who you are, but what you are. And it's a really devastating thought to me to think about how life falls for everybody, especially people like Taylor Swift. She has what a normal person would say is everything that someone could dream of. Whereas for her, it's like she wants all of these things out of life and she wants all of these connections that she just can't have, and she's desperate to have them, and she's desperate to have this life that she thought she could still have and can't. And looking at it from a personal level, it's a feeling that I can relate to so much because I live in a world where my own mother doesn't even want me in her life. So to feel that emotion on such an extreme level with everyone that she comes in contact to, I just can't imagine it. And it there's so many thoughts and feelings that I have of my own personal experience that I wrap up into it, that it just, everything about it destroys me inside and out.
I think what you're speaking to is just evidence of what I think the greatest strength of this album's songwriting is that it manages to mine universality out of what Taylor is going through better than she's ever done that before.
Mhm.
And she's been doing it like for a long time, and she's done it well before. But I would just argue that this more raw, unfiltered, revealing, and yes, occasionally cringy take on this is so much more interesting and just so much more relatable. It feels more dynamic, it feels more interesting, and it allows everyone to seep into the cracks a little bit and have that genuine emotional reaction from just one of the many incredibly very charged songs on here. I feel like more than ever, this is the most emotionally fraught and complicated album that she's ever made. And I think that's why I hold the fondness for it that I do, is that it lends you an insight that for all of people talking about how this, it's very samey, about how she never does anything new, this gives me something I've never gotten from her before. And I find that extremely valuable.
Beautiful. I think I've said way more than enough on this album, and I think that's a really nice note to end on. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Jams and Tea. Let us know what you thought of either of the albums we discussed today, Cindy Lee's Diamond Jubilee, and of course Taylor Swift's Tortured Poets Department, in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation down there. We'll see you next time. Until then, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, lays, bet you can't eat just one.